All right. Now we're being live streamed. And so now I'm going to go over to the other computer and do my magical stuff here, which hopefully it'd be showing up here. Oops, I need to refresh this page too. These things are so tricky. All right, there we go. Now put that on and switch this to stereo mix. Yeah, someday I'm going to get a mixer, which I think would be pretty cool. There we go. And there we are, and live, and we are reading the book Absence from Felicity by Dr. Kenneth Wapnick. It is the story of the scribing, basically, of A Course in Miracles, and the really story about Helen Schuckman and her development of willingness. And we had just read a bit where she was talking about that they were going to go to the Mayo Clinic, and she had had a dream or a vision of this church that would be right nearby the Mayo Clinic. Mm-hmm. And that she was so certain that they were going to see. So we just had read about what she saw. And so we didn't go on and read about what actually transpired when they got there. And so
which I do recall from my previous reading, which is pretty interesting.
Yes. So,
and having been there a couple times myself, yeah, I actually was there in a technical capacity, servicing some fiber optic transceivers for the Mayo Clinic back in the late 80s. And I made 2 trips out there with boxes of these little modules that would, slid into electronic equipment racks. And I was in charge of trying to make a kind of the proverbial 3 pounds of features fit into a 2-pound can, and didn't quite work because it was sort of over-specified. The specs were a little bit more ambitious than was realistically possible with that design. But I tried changing capacitors and resistors, and on all these boards, there was like a couple of dozen of them. And I went out there, quickly realized that it wasn't going to work, had them all shipped back, and then spent some long nights into the wee hours of the morning a couple of times soldering new components after I figure out something that would get it as close as we're going to get, and then soldering all these parts back in and then have them shipped back out there. And then I flew out there and installed them and did fine tuning and tweaking on them. And it was like two whirlwind trips about 2 or 3 weeks apart. And but I really didn't see much of the Mayo Clinic other than this one room that had all these fiber optic transceivers in it. But I remember the people there were friendly, and it was, a lovely autumn time frame. So
was that what is that, Minneapolis? Where is that?
It's near. It's not too far from Rochester. It's in Rochester.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, okay. Not too far from Minneapolis, St. Paul, which I've only been in the airport there. Interestingly enough, there's a friend of mine who I'd known for years, who I hadn't talked to in years, who was at the airport. And when I was flying back on one of those trips, I said, "Mick," he said, "Bruce," I said, "What brings you here?" And anyway, it was one of the small world encounters kind of thing. But anyway, enough of that side story. Let's get to Helen's side story, which is really all of our story about resistance, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
But anyway.
So you want to read?
Sure. I have us on the top, toward the top of the page 120. But I think I'll just start right at the top of page 120. And it begins with, its message, in quotes, provided a very down-to-earth foreshadowing of the Course's message of joining by sharing another's interest. As the Manual for Teachers would later say of the Teacher of God, his qualifications consist solely in this: somehow, somewhere, he has made a deliberate choice in what he did not see, and in which he did not see his interest as apart from someone else's. And that's right from the very first few pages of the Manual for Teachers. So Helen's narrative continues. The hospital wanted to send Bill and myself to the Mayo Clinic to study their psychological assessment procedures. The, the evening, September 9th, 1965, before we left, a picture crossed my mind that was so sharp I felt impelled to call Bill and describe it in writing. We will go to Mayo on the 10th. We will see a gray stone church with a slightly darker gray center steeple, which is very tall, and two much taller ones, one on each side. I thought briefly that there were spheres on the small spires, but then I dismissed that as too obviously phallic. But maybe the symbols aren't involved if they're just there. There is a small stone cross on the top of the largest spire. On the corner to the left, as you face the church, is a wire trash can under the streetlight. At first, I thought the church was Catholic, but it's probably Lutheran. The street behind the streetlight goes uphill sharply. It's a little crooked. There may be a parking lot of some sort of empty lot with gray stones on the corner across from the streetlight. There are little shops on both sides of the hill, but none on the side of the church or opposite it. I think there's just grass and bushes maybe. The details stood out with startling clarity. I seemed to be looking down on it from above at an angle which suggests I might be seeing it from a low-flying plane. The picture was so clear that I abandoned caution and told Bill I was sure we would see the church when we landed in Minnesota the next day. I was disappointed and angry when we saw nothing of the sort. I had gone way out on a limb and felt let down and embarrassed. In an attempt to restore my injured self-esteem, I tried to sound a little more certain than I felt. I said with great conviction that we would find the church somewhere in the town of Rochester. It was late when we arrived. We were tired and we had an early appointment the next morning. At the hotel, I looked up a church directory and found there were quite a number of churches in different parts of the city, and I still thought the church I was looking for was Lutheran. I was no longer really too sure of anything about it. We went to our rooms for a short nap, planning to meet for dinner. I could not sleep. I had to find that church. So Helen's a little bit obsessive here, but aren't we all in so many ways? It had become outrageously important to me. We took a cab after dinner and tried to find my church. Before we started out, I picked out several churches from the hotel directory that for one reason or another looked as though they might be likely candidates. They were not right. Then I described the church to the taxi driver and asked him if he knew of one reasonably like it. He did not sound helpful, although he suggested a few more possibilities. And then in brackets, Ken says, my memory of Helen and Bill's recounting of the story was that of the 27 or 28 churches in Rochester, Minnesota, they saw 24. And Helen continues, at length, Bill wisely insisted that we go back to the hotel and forget the whole thing. I hated to give up, but the driver was obviously getting worried about us and wanted us out of his cab. Besides, it was getting very late and we were both quite tired by that time. I dozed off from time to time, but kept waking up with a start in the grip of a long series of bad dreams. When I met Bill the next morning, we were both red-eyed and tired. We had barely slept. We got through our tightly scheduled day somehow, and toward evening drove wearily out to the airport. Bill went to look at a newsstand while I sat down and closed my eyes. I was too tired to look at anything. I was just dozing off. And here's your church, said Bill, holding a picture from a guidebook in front of me. See page P6 for a picture of Helen's church. Oh, yes, that's it, I said, now happily wide awake. Where is it? Nowhere, answered Bill. Here, read about it yourself. Bill was right. The church was indeed nowhere. It had once occupied the site of the Mayo Clinic, but it had been torn down when the hospital was built. So that's why I was looking down on it, I exclaimed. It was because it's in the past. It had nothing to do with planes. And then a chill went over me and I did not want to talk about the church anymore. There wasn't too much to say, really. The episode, however, had a most unexpected and very real conclusion. Do you want to pick up from there?
Sure. And for those of you who are watching on the YouTube, there is a picture of that church on the page that we're looking at. Okay. So she's seeing in the past. That's pretty crazy. On the way home, we had to change planes in Chicago and waited a good hour in a cold, almost empty airport. Wow. Chicago, I don't know, Midway or O'Hare. But wow. Huddled against a wall was a solitary young woman. I could feel waves and waves of misery going through her. I pointed her out to Bill, who was against my talking to her. We were both exhausted. It was very late, and he was not up to getting involved with strangers at that point. Besides, I might just be imagining her distress. She did not give any outward signs of anything but sleepiness. I could not, however, escape the feelings of pain I was receiving from her. Finally, I told Bill I could not help myself and went to talk to her. Helen was so empathic. It was pretty interesting. Uh, her name was Charlotte, and she said she was scared stiff. She had never been in a plane before that day and had already been several hours in the air during a very rough trip. She was severely shaken and dreadfully afraid of going on to New York, for which she was headed. Would I sit with her and hold her hand? Of course, I told her. It's just that way at first. After a while, you get so used to it that you don't mind it a bit. I took Charlotte over to Bill, explained the situation, and suggested that she sit between us on the plane so she could have a friend on both sides. Bill was courteous, of course, but I could tell he was not pleased with me. He had not had a very happy trip, and it was in the middle of the night. He felt with some justice that we could do with a peaceful trip home. Charlotte shook badly as the plane took off, but I patted her hand and she calmed down quickly. Then she wanted to talk. Charlotte was 19 and leaving home because her stepmother hated her, and her father, whom she loved, had turned against her. She intended to get a job and never go home again. It turned out, however, that she had done remarkably little in the way of planning and had no idea where she would stay in New York, and it had not occurred to her that the airport might be some distance from the city. She was not worried, however, because she had $300 with her. Besides, she was a Lutheran, and she was sure that all she had to do was find a Lutheran church, and they would be glad to take care of her. Bill and I exchanged glances. The message was not hard to grasp. And this, said the voice, is really my church. Oh my God. Oh,
Hmm.
that's just amazing.
Yep.
This, said the voice, is really my church. Bill may have objected to getting involved with Charlotte originally, but he certainly rallied now. When we reached the airport, Charlotte went to the ladies' room. Bill and I held an emergency conference while she was gone. It was obvious that she could not take care of herself in the city. Bill phoned a New York hotel for women, the Barbizon, and reserved a room for her. We took her to the hotel in our cab and told her I would call her there the next day. When I called, Charlotte sounded happy and excited. She was going sightseeing and shopping. I gave her my address and phone number and told her to get in touch with me if she needed anything. We had no trouble in keeping in touch with her. That afternoon, Bill ran into her accidentally in a department store, Bloomingdale's, and the following evening she dropped in at my house for dinner. Louie and I were both friendly, and she came back the next evening. Her money was getting low, and she thought maybe we could find a less expensive place for her. There was a Lutheran church nearby, and after dinner I walked Charlotte over to it. It was crowded, and there was a long waiting list for a room. I guess they had rooms at the church.
Hmm.
Okay, but they somehow made room for Charlotte. The place was clean, safe, and inexpensive. It seemed perfect. Charlotte usually ended up at my apartment around dinner time. This is so sweet. Charlotte stayed in New York about 10 days. She found a job and announced that she was really settled at last. The next evening, she called just before midnight. She sounded desperate and talked almost incoherently. She said that she had to go home immediately because she had called her father and found that he had attempted suicide because she had left. She said she had been walking up and down in the street for several hours before she made her decision. She did not have much money left, but she still had enough for a cab to the airport, and she bought a return ticket with greater foresight than I would have credited her with. Well, things were different with airlines back then.
Hmm.
Uh, um, So Charlotte's story sounded odd, but there was no doubt that she was frantic. She said the plane was leaving shortly and she had no time to arrange to have her luggage sent on. She gave me her home address and asked if I could take care of it. I told her to forget about the luggage and go, since it was clear she was going to do that anyway. The next day, I made the necessary arrangements and dropped Charlotte a line to tell her that things were on their way. Excuse me. Shortly afterwards, I got a long letter from her. She said she wanted to tell me the truth because her conscience was bothering her. She was, it seemed, quite a bit older than she had said. She was married and had 3 children, but they were, quote, difficult. And she and her husband did not get along. She had been getting terribly nervous and had decided to go to New York and make a new life for herself. She said that New York was a wonderful place and everyone was so nice to her that she knew the bad things that people said about big cities weren't true. She hoped someday to come back for a visit. Wow. So so this is a whole different story than what she told them, but it's just so sweet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so continuing. Charlotte and I have corresponded for years now. She seems to have gotten herself fairly well straightened out, although she still has her ups and downs. I always enjoy hearing from her, especially as I am very grateful to her. I have an idea that I might have never found that scroll, see below, without her help. It might well be that magic had to end in the plain fact of Charlotte before I could make the final decision to abandon magic in exchange for something more desirable. And I just wanted to stop here a minute and recognize that in our Thursday evening group, we've been reading this section of the manual for teachers about our psychic powers desirable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as I've been reading that, I've been thinking about Helen.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah. I
Look
couldn't
in my
resist.
mind.
I couldn't resist.
And as I've been reading that section, oh, I got to tell you, this group, we have been reading this manual for teachers for, I don't know, maybe a couple years. I don't know, but we're just on this section, and we've been on this same section for like 4 weeks.
Wow.
Because of these very ideas that are coming forth, that you can have a feeling about somebody or a thought about somebody. Here Helen was relying on psychic abilities, even though she rejected the idea of psychic abilities because she was a scientist and didn't think that it was appropriate or had anything it had any reality to it. And that's kind of how that section is written. It's like, yes, they really don't, but they really do. They really are, but they really aren't. And don't let yourself be delayed by any of this. Don't, if it's going to help you, use it. If it's not going to help you, move on. And so I just find this is really interesting that we're reading this right now. Thus the experience concretized Helen's decision to abandon the temptation once and for all to misuse the power of her mind, which is in parens as magic, choosing instead to utilize it on behalf of Jesus's love, in parens the miracle. As A Course in Miracles later said about psychic powers, excuse me again, the Holy Spirit needs these gifts, and those who offer them to him and him alone go with Christ's gratitude upon their hearts, his holy sight not far behind. And that again is from the Manual for Teachers, section 25. So it's very interesting, because this is, Helen, using all these psychic abilities and magical abilities, and attributing them to something else, maybe other than the Holy Spirit. But anyway, this is great.
Yeah. I mean, she obviously had an insight as to what had been there at the Mayo Clinic and had that sort of archetypal vision, if you will, I guess.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
then of course her the real the real purpose in the follow-on story with Charlotte, was like, oh, I mean, we're here to be truly helpful, and then and the expression of kindness, the form it took wasn't important, but the idea that we're all in it together, and we're all in the same boat, and fighting the same hard battle, even though the forms can be dramatically different at times. And the
yeah,
forms don't really matter. And in the case of Charlotte's, it really didn't matter if it was, her father-in-law or her husband, and that situation. The fact that she needed help was really the important recognition as the call for help, which is really all of our call for help that is all the same, right?
yeah, and just the impact on a person's life if you are in a situation where you are in deep fear or whatever, that some strange person would come to you and say, come and sit with me, you can ride with me, I'll find you a place, I'll take care of you. It was like, Helen was like the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Appearing in this person's life. It was like a miracle for her, I'm sure,
Mm-hmm.
because this young lady seemed to be very confused and leave, and probably really conflicted, leaving a husband and 3 children,
Sure.
go off to New York City. I've often thought about that myself when my kids were little. Geez.
Abandoned ship.
Maybe I could go live on the beach somewhere.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, but as we're been reading, that Helen's guidance, as is really all of ours, is to be for each other a safe haven, representing the Holy Spirit's message of innocence and the ego storm of guilt, and that welcoming safety in our mind is really the important quality that we're here to find for ourselves, and really find more deeply by sharing it. And in fact, that's the only way that we can really experience it completely, is by sharing it with everyone we meet, physically or mentally, as the Course reminds us, right? And
Yeah.
really, it's all mental ultimately. but while we still think that there's form, we need to, practice it on the level of form, and then use that as a trigger to get back to someone else's call for love is really my call for love. Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the reminder, Holy Spirit.
I mean, it is interesting that, this was, it's almost like, that things appeared for Helen that were necessary for her being able to accept, what was happening to her and what she was experiencing, in a friendlier way, or a way that she could process,
Mm-hmm.
rather than, and especially after she went through the whole disappointment of driving around looking for churches all night, and then finding out that the church she was looking for was there. It just was not at the same time.
Right. And
There.
then the real church, the real sacred space, if you will, is in the mind that sees everyone as innocent. And she demonstrated that with how Bill and Helen uh, literally sheltered Charlotte by surrounding her on either side of the airplane seat, with their presence of calm and the quiet center. I'm reminded too of one of Ken Wapnick's wonderful programs that talks about it's the Arch of Forgiveness. It talks about a D.H. Lawrence book, I believe, where it was talking about the parents then provided that nurturing environment for a child. I don't recall the rest of the story, but it's something to that effect, that that's really what we're all asked to do, is provide that, not by ourselves, but really from letting Holy Spirit work through us, provide that nurturing, caring, supportive environment for everyone we meet, not to be superheroes in the world, but to be as peaceful as we possibly can by by recognizing that our real identity isn't in the world. I was thinking about that this morning as I was out for a short walk. Since this is a little earlier than some of my earlier weekday sessions, I went for a shorter walk. But then as I was walking, I was looking at a few of the Halloween decorations in this community we now live in, and thinking, well, there's not as many as there usually are in places we've lived before that are kind of all age communities where there's a lot of kids, and then the lawn decorations for Halloween are out in full force. But there was enough to remind me. It's like, oh yeah, Halloween's coming up. And then I was thinking, well, we're all in costume, not just at the end of October. Some of us do that once in a while, but it's 24/7, 365. We're all in these elaborate costumes of our own making, at least on some unconscious level, that we call our bodies, that are really just poster children for this thought system that we made up also, that is ultimately just a silly, forgivable dream, an elaborate story, a narrative that really has no bearing in truth, but that becomes our way back. Each part of that story, whether in the case of Helen and Bill's episode with Charlotte, or each of us in our day-to-day interactions with the people we live with, work with, interact with on the roads and shops that we visit, whatever. I mean, doesn't matter, or the ones we think about that cross our digital screens of all shapes and sizes. Those are all of our forgiveness classrooms and opportunities to see, wow, everyone's in costume here, and I'm no different, and we can all use that as a way to gently release ourselves from the tyranny of those stories. Right?
Exactly. And Dove wrote something yesterday, I think, about Halloween is a time, or this life is like Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
We all put on a costume and then say, guess who I am? Uh, and that's
Boo.
it. Boo. Boo-hoo. Oh gosh. So you want to read on?
Sure.
Okay.
I have us toward the middle of page 124 in the print version for those who are reading along. I'm going to read the footnote first, which is a little bit farther. Well, I'll read it right after I read it, what it refers to, actually. Okay. Helen's always spoke fondly of Charlotte, and I recall her receiving a call from Charlotte in my presence, and they're having a brief, though warm, conversation. For her part, Charlotte remained grateful to Helen and Bill for their loving and caring help. Incidentally, Charlotte ultimately left her husband, but reported to Helen that she was happy and peaceful. Helen's, quote, magic phase, unquote, came to a stunning end with one final, quote, picture episode, unquote, in which she knew that she had made an, quote, irrevocable choice, unquote, a choice to set aside any temptations to misuse the power of her mind. This was a choice she obviously, according to these summer experiences at least, had been most ambivalent about in the past. And so I'm going to read the first sentence and then read the footnote and then read it again. I saw myself entering a cave in a rock formation on a bleak, windswept seacoast. And then the footnote, number 27, is sometime afterwards, Helen wrote, when I went to Israel several years later, I was startled to see that same seacoast at Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And then it says, see pages 356F. So anyway, so this actually relates to a trip that Helen and Bill and Ken took to Israel and to the Middle East, and they really did go through those caves, and so anyway, but this is the vision that she had. So Helen, let's start that paragraph again. I saw myself entering a cave in a rock formation on a bleak, windswept seacoast. The entrance to the cave was low, and the cave was quite deep. All I found in it was a very old and large parchment scroll. Its ends were rolled around heavy gold-tipped poles, and the two sides touching at the scroll's center and tied together by a strip of parchment that fell away as my fingers touched it. I untied the ends and opened the scroll just enough to expose the center panel on which only 2 words were written. God is, and nothing else. Then, and the God is in quotes. Then I slowly unrolled the scroll further, and tiny black letters began to appear on both sides of the panel. The voice explained the situation to me. If you look at the left panel, you will be able to read about everything that happened in the past. And if you look at the right panel, you will be able to read about everything that will happen in the future. The little letters on the sides of the panel were becoming clearer, and for several minutes I was tempted to look at them. Then I made a decision. I rolled up the scroll to conceal everything except the center panel. I'm not interested in the past or the future, I said with finality. I'll just stop with this. The voice sounded both reassured and reassuring. I was astonished at the depth of gratitude that it somehow conveyed. Thank you, it said. You made it that time. Thank you. And that, it seemed, was that. I have a friend who made a print of that scroll, an artistic version of it, rendering of it, and with the God is in the center panel, and nothing else unfurled or revealed on either side. And it was hanging on the wall of her home when I visited there a few years ago. Anyway, but yeah, it kind of reminds us that if we're preoccupied with the past or the future, that's usually a clue that ego's taking charge of things, and we're forgetting to do what we can right now to follow Holy Spirit's curriculum, right?
Yeah, and it is really interesting that without the teaching of A Course in Miracles that tells us that there is no past and there is no future, and now is the only time, the holy instant is the only thing that's real. Without that teaching, that she would have had a vision that would have brought that home to her, and she could have made that choice without the teaching of the Course to bring her to that. I mean, obviously, she didn't like completely do that, or that would have been the end of it. And, there would have been no more drama in the life of Helen, but that it was shown to her and she made the decision. I think that is the important thing.
Yeah, yeah, and we're all making that decision when we look without condemnation on the ego's insanity and say, I could see peace instead of this right now. It is possible, and that's an ongoing process. So we need to really be really patient and gentle with ourselves as we go through the challenge that we've set up, unconsciously for the most part, and bring them to conscious awareness and realize, oh, right now I could see peace instead of whatever this specific is. But each specific then becomes the classroom. So we need all the specifics to jog our memory. That's like there's another way. There must be another
Yeah.
way, and there is another way.
And it's interesting because a lot of times people think that the past is in the books and the future is in the books, but none of those things actually even exist at all. This is why you can't predict the future because it doesn't exist. You can't predict the past because it never happened. Even the memories or the stories that we have and the imaginations that we have. And this is why it's so clear to us, Jesus is telling us, forget about those things. Don't project the past into the future. Don't think that because things seem to have happened a certain way that they're going to happen that way again, because none of it actually is at all. This is why God doesn't know about these things. God can't help me in the future, and God couldn't have changed anything in the past because God is, and those things do not exist. So, okay. So do you want to continue or want me to read?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so as with the subway experience several years earlier, an aspect of the cave experience likewise found its way into the course. The workbook states, "We say God is, and then we cease to speak. For in that knowledge, words are meaningless." And that's workbook lesson 159 or 169. What is of God and therefore remains beyond the world remains also beyond the capabilities of words to express its truth. The Manual for Teachers states, and this is from section 21, God does not understand words, for they were made by separated minds to keep them in the illusion of separation. Let us not forget that words are but symbols of symbols. They are thus twice removed from reality. And we say that all the time. But do we really mean it? Do we really know what that is? Because we still think God knows words. We still think God knows the world. We still think that God knows these things, but God doesn't. Not because God's not omniscient, but because it doesn't exist. It and that's all. It's just symbols of symbols twice removed from reality. Again, Ken continues. The cave experience, together with the Mayo Clinic episode, seemed to bring this period to a successful close and mark the end of Helen's preparation for the scribing of A Course in Miracles. Whatever ego issues remained for her on a conscious level, she nonetheless, on a far deeper level, had decided irrevocably to allow her mind to be a clear instrument for the love of Jesus to pass through. As she wrote simply again, and that, it seemed, was that. And that, it seemed, was that. Oh my gosh.
QED.
QED. This unusual but wearying period from June to the end of the summer had now ended, and Bill suggested it might be a good idea to take a few days off and go to Virginia Beach to visit the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the organization founded by Edgar Cayce. So this is where the ARE comes in. And Bill was quite interested in Edgar Cayce. And Edgar Cayce is famous for his ability to, quote, read the Akashic record, that somehow he could see the past and the future. I'm sorry. Because I just explained it doesn't even exist. But this is again, I'm not going to go into that. As I already mentioned, Bill had become most interested in Cayce and his work and felt that a visit might be helpful to clarify the events of the past summer. Helen, as would be expected, felt different, although she reluctantly agreed to go. And here's Helen's description. The idea did not appeal to me. That sort of thing still frightened me, and I did not want it to be true. It was bad enough that I did not understand what was happening to me. I particularly did not want any exacerbation of my unfortunate, quote, magical efforts, which I was by now more than willing to abandon. Nevertheless, the idea of a short vacation sounded good, and my husband, knowing I was tired, encouraged me to go. It was a perfect time of the year for the trip, and he thought it would do me good. He and Bill had become friends, and although he felt Bill was developing some rather strange interests, my husband knew he would take care of me. I set out for Virginia Beach with some misgivings, but looking forward to the rest. As it turned out, the trip was anything but restful for me. The people at the Association for Research and Enlightenment, then only a small group devoted to making the Cayce material available to the public, were intelligent, sincere, and obviously sane. Nor was the massive documentation something one could easily brush aside. I was impressed, but very uneasy. As Bill's, she just saw this. God is, and the past and the future don't exist. This is complete conflict with her, with her information.
And again, relating to the parallels for each of us, we're all presented in A Course in Miracles with a thought system that is completely polarized, although it doesn't fight back, to the ego's insanity, which is 100% insane. The ego's craziness is matched perfectly by the 100% sanity of the Holy Spirit, which thought by thought has a perfect antidote and replacement for every crazy thought that the ego has. And our task is to keep practicing and using those antidotes and those undoing remedies until we've freed ourselves from that tyrannical rule. But Helen's experience with the ARE and Virginia Beach was just like, well, okay, now I'm confronted with a little bit more in my face understanding that I've got this whole reality thing upside down, backwards, and inside out, which is, the Course asks us to consider all the time. There is no world. This is the central thought the Course attempts to teach. Like, what? say that again. Because none of us want to believe that as egos, but what we really are, not who we think we are, but what we really are, says, oh, yes, the relief. You made it again. You look like Helen looking at the God is scroll and saying, oh, this time you made it. And each moment that we recognize that there must be a better way over and over again, and make that better way, that inner kindness teachers is so profoundly thankful and grateful, because it's like, oh, I'm being restored to my real identity. And that's what we all feel, I think, as we do that. That's why it's it's inner peace that the Course emphasizes, not any kind of external ceasefire. Yeah.
Yeah, and the relief that she felt from the God is, and just recognizing, oh, the past and the future are not relevant. There's no reason to look at either one of them. And then to go to this place where that was the major focus of their work, was looking at the past and the future and thinking about the story of the illusion, which we know now, the timelines of the illusion and the various dreams that were in the illusion, all that stuff. She was relieved to know that was not real, even though she may not have known that on a intellectual basis. She did experience it in her internal being, or her own soul. So that idea, then now she's being confronted with the work at the ARE, which Bill was very interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously she was not.
Yeah. Well, some part of her mind probably was, but that part was still struggling to, well, the ego is struggling to fight that. And that's what I think we're reading here.
Exactly. So let's see. So as Bill's interest deepened and my own anxiety grew, Bill read further on the subject that afternoon, and he also brought some books to take home. I rifled through a volume and put it down abruptly, in sufficient discomfort to border on panic. And I don't think this was just Helen being panicky. I think she just recognized, whoa, this is not relevant, and is dragging me back into something that I don't want to be in. So anyway, Helen continues. I was glad when the trip was over. Back home, I glanced at several of the books Bill had brought, but I could not read them. To me, they merely seemed to sound the magic note again. So she had an experience. She had an experience. She knew that was not true, but now she's helping or indulging Bill with this. And I'm sure he was very confused too, because she had all those visions and stuff, and he was trying to figure stuff out too.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking about, several years ago, a decade or more ago, I remember watching with some friends who we ended up being neighbors with in the Oregon coast, the very popular video, The Secret. And we were talking about that, and just kind of classic New Age kind of stuff. And it mentions the mind, but then very quickly, devolves, you might say, into how can I use my mind to make this world work for me, and in all of its different facets and aspects and whatnot. And I was struck with the notion that's like, well, here, the actual important point is that the mind is really, tremendously powerful, and we make this stuff up. But the point is, and I think what you're referring to is in Helen's hesitancy to delve into this was, well, what is it for? What's the purpose? Why am I using the mind? And that's where the magic comes in. And the magic is really applies whenever we think I can use my mind to make the dream better, and to put our dream repair technician hats back on again, as we do most of the day, if we're honest with ourselves, and just say, oh, well, I must have been afraid of the peace and the loving kindness in my mind that's possible, in fact, inevitable, when I just finally take a break from trying to fix the dream, trying to, based on the idea that I'm upset because of what's happening or not happening in the world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we look at, how long have you been studying the course? How long have I been studying the course? And, seeing these realizations over and over and over and over again. And still, I'm very confused.
Sure. Well, because there's an enormous pull of the ego to say, no, don't go there. Don't touch that that decision-making emergency cover, that the ego's put over it, that says, danger, keep out, high voltage, lethal, skull and crossbones, whatever it can muster to keep us away from that part of our mind that would choose against the ego thought system altogether. But we do that even if albeit briefly, whenever we question the ego's condemning thoughts and say, well, what if I don't need to judge, because I can't really judge. What I really am doesn't have that capacity to judge, because it has such a tiny subset of the information needed, and that's even on the level of a dream, let alone the information of what's beyond the dream, outside the dream, of space-time duality and so forth, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But
And
there's
that's
nothing wrong with magic. It just doesn't get us where we want to go. So,
right.
so Helen's hesitancy about delving in the magic, I think, really ties nicely to that. The episode in the scroll only unfurled to the point where God was visible, and the past and the present and the future were untouched. We're just she recognized that those really the magic of trying to manipulate the dream of of time and space, and the magic of trying to make the myth of personhood become more successful. It's like, well, okay, what if that's just a silly, forgivable thing,
Yeah, yeah. And it just is something you can actually do. And
Mhm.
Helen knew. I mean, I think, I'm going to continue reading here about Edgar Casey, but maybe Edgar Casey saw that same scroll and said, oh, let's unroll the whole thing.
Yeah, and there's nothing, and again, there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
It's not the focus of the course.
Yeah.
I mean, there's
And
thousands of other paths that involve looking at that, but the course is it's not strict, but it's undiluted, is how I think of it, as far as the pure non-dual metaphysics of the course is really always and only about looking at the mind and using Holy Spirit's guidance by switching our decision-making faculty over to that. And the way we usually do that is by recognizing the discomfort of having chosen the ego as our guiding thought system. And it's just realizing, well, that's not working. It's just not cutting it for me. Never has, never will.
yeah, the course is uncompromising. And people who, think that, it opens up anything for duality, are looking for compromise.
Yeah. And
And
it is uncompromising in the most beautiful, perfect, non-judgmental way, because it's not saying that what we really are has been compromised. It's just saying that the ego is the compromise. The decision to believe in the ego is the compromise that we're all needlessly making and needlessly suffering because of.
exactly, exactly. And we can choose again, again,
Mhm.
again, and again,
You can say that again.
again. All right, I'm going to be mindful of your time because
Okay.
I think you're going to leave probably no 3 or 4 more minutes.
Yeah, about
Okay.
5.
All right. So, um, you wanna read? You can just read until you're
Sure.
okay.
Sure. Let's see. Where we go. Okay. Bottom of page 126. Helen and Bill were to return to Virginia Beach shortly after the course began, and over the years developed a helpful friendship with Hugh Casey, who was extremely supportive of Helen. Helen and Bill made copies of the as yet incomplete manuscript for him, and he was obviously impressed with that, with what he read. Helen and Bill later told me that Hewlin felt that his father Edgar had something to do with the transmission of the course. After one of their visits at the ARE, which is the Association for Research and Enlightenment, Casey walked Helen to the door of his office saying, "You must be a very advanced soul, but you certainly don't look it."
Backward compliments.
Nothing so blinding as perception of form. Helen later wrote about her experiences at the ARE. And then she says, "Fortunately, as my anxiety subsided and I became more familiar with the work of the ARE, this inaccurate picture of its activities and purposes was corrected. I have been a member for a number of years now, and I have considerable respect for the group and its aims. I am particularly indebted to Hugh and Casey for giving so much time out of his very busy life to my manuscript, and also for his consistent friendship, patience, and encouragement." After the scribing, and Ken continues, after the scribing was completed, Helen and Bill prepared a copy of the manuscript for Hugh Lynn. This, incidentally, was the manuscript I first saw, which Helen, Bill, and I always referred to as the Hugh Lynn version. And of course, that's been replicated many, many times, as have numerous other variations of the course, which I sort of think of as rough drafts, but uh, people find benefit from them. But I think there's just so much in the finished version of the course that the Foundation for Inner Peace puts out that I haven't taken the time to really get into the Ur text or the Center of Atonement, the
Oh yeah.
multi-inch thick version with all the annotations. I'm sure there's good stuff in there. I just haven't taken the time to explore it.
Yeah.
There's actually some really easy, even-handed, I guess is the correct word, review of that particular version in the on the FIP website, acim.org. If you look for the Q&A section that Dr. Bob Rosenthal wrote some really nice even-handed commentary on that, and also A Course of Love and things like that. So
Yeah, Dr. Bob was really, I mean, what a saint. And
yeah.
he really did, because I'm telling you, I have a lot of just to a real quick story, because I know you have to go. But yeah, the Hugh Lynn version, which is the one that was at the ARE, some friends of mine went down there and visiting under the auspices of being, honest folk. But they got that copy of that book, and my one friend actually secreted it out of there in her boot. Somehow or the other, she was able to put it in her boot.
How
And
big a boot did that have to be?
I don't know, but she
Unless it
did.
was on a thumb drive or something.
No, no, no. This is long before thumb drives. They
Wow.
physically took it to Kinko's and had copies made of it, and then took it back and put it back where it in the shelf
Okay, I've heard that
originally.
story. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and then they took those copies and made multiple copies and distributed all over the world, first in Australia and then in other places. But that it was not complete, because it hadn't actually gone through Jesus's editing with Helen. So there's a lot of people that think that that's the real version of A Course in Miracles, and the rest of us are all crazy. And one of those original Hewlin versions, John Mundy had one of those, and he gave it over to Rev Tony Ponticello for the Community Miracle Center. So
Okay.
Rev Tony has actually one of those original copies also.
Okay. Well, thanks, Lynn. I'm going to sign off now and we'll pick up where we left off. Always enjoy our weekly conversations, and apologies for leaving a little early, and we'll look forward to picking up where we left off next week.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Bruce. I
Oh,
appreciate you, and have fun being Tim.
we're all the same. There's no differences here. Thanks.